Still trying to nail the perfect steak? Here are the best cooking methods around, according to some of the best chefs in the biz. Most of the chefs who spoke to MASH agreed that grilling is the best way to cook a steak. Chef David Lawrence of Goodnight's Prime Steak and Spirits in California says, "When I'm cooking at home, it's all about grilling, grilling, grilling. The grill amplifies the steak's natural fats and juices for flavor.
But by the time this day is over, they'll have been taken by the grill and delicately and tenderly shown the ways of flavorful meat love."
Chef Seamus Guevara of California's Farm Stand also loves the grill, particularly in summer months when he prefers cooking up thinner cuts over a blisteringly hot grill. That said, grilling isn't always ideal. Jimmy Chill, head chef and culinary director at the restaurant Bronja in Miami, explains, "Open-fire grills are not always great, especially with steaks that have delicate flavors like New York strip and tenderloin. The smoky flavors can easily mask the flavors of the meat. But the reason most chefs love the grill best has less to do with the finished product as it does the general experience of grilling and the easy cleanup. Indeed, when it comes to her favorite steak, a ribeye, Katie Flannery of Flannery Beef notes she almost always opts for the grill. She says, "I do not think it's the single best way to cook a steak, but it's one of the best."
The first time is so beautiful.
Broiled steak is a retro fave, earning the #1 spot on Betty Crocker's list of the top 12 dishes of 1958. While broiling might not be used by many home cooks, the chefs who spoke to MASH agreed that it's a go-to in a restaurant setting. As Chef Matt Creeder of Steak 954 tells us, "I use broilers every day. It's still a great cooking method that delivers a consistently great product. Want to cook a mid-rare steak in less than 10 minutes? Broil it." The reason why this method works so well is simple, according to Katie Flannery. Broiling and grilling are pretty much the same technique. The only difference is where the heat is coming from. She says, "Not everyone has access to an outdoor grill, and I would encourage anyone with only a broiler to embrace it." But the broiler is not just for those who are making do. Flannery explains that broiling gives you even more control than grilling. Chef David Lawrence loves this method too, noting it doesn't impart quite as many charred notes, letting the true flavor of the steak sing. To get the ideal result with this technique, Chef Seamus Guevara highlights the importance of choosing a thicker cut, like a bone-in ribeye, and properly tempering it before getting started. Cooking steak on a flat-top griddle, or plancha, renders similar results to cooking in cast iron. Chef Jimmy Chill dubs this his favorite steak cooking method, noting that all you need is a touch of vegetable oil, salt, and pepper for steaks to really sing on the plancha, he says. Cooking steak this way gives it a beautiful crust while still juicy and tender inside. While truly it depends on the cut, this works for 70% of cuts. Chef Matt Creeder doesn't prefer this method, however, noting that there are better ways. That said, Chef David Lawrence says he has used a griddle in a pinch while camping. Meanwhile, Chef Seamus Guevara notes that it's a go-to for those with smaller pro kitchens. He adds, slow-cooked Chicago-style chipped beef sandwiches, like the one from the now infamous TV show The Bear, are finished this way. This technique allows a cook to quickly sear a lot of sliced beef at once as the orders roll in. Flambéing steak is an old-school method you'll come across in some pricey dining rooms. Chefs like to engage in this practice not just for the flavor, but also the flair. Chef David Lawrence notes that in the restaurants in which he has worked, flambéing tableside has always been a showstopper. He adds, "Flambéing brings an element of drama to the steak's preparation."
Showtime.
And while it's certainly not common, there are a few recipes for which this method can be genuinely worthwhile. Chief among them is Steak Diane. This retro recipe sees beef tenderloin browned in a combination of butter and olive oil before being mixed with a pan sauce of mushrooms, shallots, and garlic. Cognac is added and flambéed, imparting, according to Chef Seamus Guevara, an irresistible flavor. The final sauce is enriched with mustard and cream before serving. Moreover, Flannery notes that steaks such as filet are perfect for this technique. She explains, "The idea of flambé beyond the drama is to impart a specific flavor to the steak. That is why I would choose the filet, as it has minimum flavor of its own. And above all, be sure to do it in full view of your guests so that they can truly appreciate the spectacle." If your steak is on the larger side, a double-barreled cooking method might be your best bet. Any steak over a pound that is cooked over direct heat will burn on the outside before it cooks through. It's no wonder our chefs recommend pan-searing such steaks before finishing them in the oven. As Chef Matt Creeder says, large-format steaks tend to do well with this cooking method. It's a good way to get a nice crust and a consistent cook. Start the steak in a really hot pan, preferably cast iron. Heat up a fat with a high smoke point, such as beef tallow, grapeseed oil, or rice bran oil, and be sure not to overcrowd the pan. Once the beef is browned on both sides, finish it in an oven at 375 degrees Fahrenheit until it reaches an internal temperature of 145 degrees Fahrenheit. Be sure to let it rest before serving. This method is best if you really want that caramelization and char, according to Flannery. She explains, "I believe the question of searing is really a question of visual presentation and texture. Do you like a seriously dark look and a crusty exterior on your steak? That is what you can achieve with a sear." Reverse searing is all the rage these days, subverting the tried and true method of searing first. Instead, as the term suggests, reverse searing sees the steak start in a low oven and finish with a hard sear to achieve that perfectly crispy crust. But while some adore this technique, such as celebrity chef Andrew Zimmern, our experts aren't necessarily impressed. Flannery explains, "I don't like reverse searing because as good as I am, I'm not that good, and reverse searing is less forgiving." Because most of the cooking is done before the meat is seared, she explains there's no room for error. She adds, "With reverse searing, you better be perfect with the front end because you are about to apply a ton of heat at the back end, especially if you like a heavy crust." That said, this method does have its place, especially if you're prepping meat for a crowd. Guevara explains, "Slow roasting a large cut of steak to rare and then searing hard to achieve a proper crust allows for better execution for big shareable dinners." Meanwhile, Chef David Lawrence says, "It's not a method I use personally, but it's a good technique if you want to low-temperature cook your meat and still want a good crust." Deep frying steak may strike you as odd, but it's actually yet another on-trend method experts love for a foolproof, crispy crust. Some recipes, like chicharrón de ribeye or deep-fried wagyu, really lean into this maximalist approach. That said, the novelty of it doesn't convince many of our experts. Chef Creeder notes, "I would never deep fry a steak." That said, he claims he's been intrigued by approaches at Japanese steakhouses where A5 grade wagyu is battered in tempura and deep-fried. Chef Kyle Kingry notes that at his restaurant Toku, some of the steaks are deep or shallow fried. Chef David Lawrence says he too has relied on shallow frying on occasion for the perfect steak. He says, "If I am cooking in the house, I would shallow fry my steak in a black Skittle pan or a French Le Creuset pan. This is especially helpful if I wanted to make a pan sauce to serve with it. I would add diced carrots, shallots, herbs, red wine, and stock to the pan after cooking the steak." Marinating steak isn't necessarily a cooking method, but it can be an essential way of adding tenderness and flavor. Guevara explains, "Marinades are irreplaceable for cuts such as skirt steak, cross-cut short ribs, flank, and hanger steak, since the striated nature of those muscle fibers allows for wet marinades to be absorbed quickly and efficiently. This imparts a level of flavor impossible to achieve in these cuts otherwise." He particularly loves marinating skirt steak in an asada-style blend of orange zest, orange juice, lime juice, salt, manzano peppers, wild herbs, and beer. And he's also a fan of marinating cross-cut short ribs Calbee style with tamari, ginger, scallions, and green garlic. Lawrence agrees, noting that very lean steaks, like flank steak, tend to naturally have less flavor than well-marbled ones. In these cases, he says a marinade provides a needed flavor punch. That said, not all steaks need a marinade, Katie Flannery explains. Top-tier steaks, ribeye, New York, filet, I would never marinate, period. And while she agrees that some cuts like skirt or hanger do benefit from a marinade, she admits she likely wouldn't use one, adding, "I'm a bit of a purist. Just salt and pepper is sufficient for me."
S&P, the choice for me.
If you're feeding a crowd in summertime, there's perhaps no better approach than grilling steak kebabs. Chef Seamus Guevara says, "This cooking technique primarily allows for smaller cuts to be grilled evenly and requires no slicing afterward. Depending on the cut you use, they can be a real treat." Flannery recommends opting for tender cuts like filet, top sirloin, or tri-tip. She says, if possible to source, filet tips or tails are a very affordable alternative to a high-priced filet. Picanha is another option she recommends, something that Chef Matt Creeder notes is quite common in South Florida, but is also beloved throughout Latin America and specifically in Brazil. He says, "The biggest concern is proper spacing with all your ingredients so they cook properly." And that's not the only technical tip our experts have to offer when it comes to kebabs. Flannery notes that it's important to trim away any nerve or fascia you may see, which might contribute to a tougher texture. And Guevara recommends marinating the steak before skewering. The steak isn't the only thing you should soak either, according to Chef David Lawrence. He says, "The one tip I tell everyone is to soak your skewers in water before use, so they don't burn while the meat cooks." Even experts who won't deep fry their steaks will bend that rule for a good chicken fried steak. Chef Kyle Kingery says, "I grew up in the mountains of North Carolina, so personally I like chicken fried steak." This dish is typically made with chuck steak that has been tenderized. It's then breaded in a seasoned mix of flour and cornmeal before being deep or shallow fried and served with a white gravy, often, Kingery says, for breakfast. This is, however, a fairly regional specialty, and it can be tough to get behind if you're not used to it. Chef David Lawrence says, "Chicken fried steak has never appealed to me. It's not a dish I ever grew up with in England." Katie Flannery of Flannery Beef also did not grow up with the dish. She says, "I can probably count on one hand the number of times I've had it and have never cooked it myself." If she did, however, she says she'd probably trade up from the more common top or bottom round to a top sirloin. Flannery adds, "It will be a little more expensive, but only just a little. The end result using sirloin will be a factor of 2 or 3 better." Creeder is all in favor of adding a bit more luxury to this cut. He explains, "I recently chicken fried a Wagyu ribeye for fun. It was one of the best things I've eaten."